Brian Green is Assistant Director of Campus Ethics at Martin Center in Santa Clara. He did his PhD here at ECU, and his teaching and research interests focus on the ethics of technology, existential risk, and transhumanism. Right.
All right, thank you. So I want to start by saying that I like Terry and Ty's paper a lot. It's very thought-provoking. I'm glad that they wrote it because I remember a conversation with Terry back in 2010 where he described some of these ideas to me and a few others, and I asked if he had shared these ideas widely, and he said no. He said they weren't yet ready to share, so he wasn't going to. But now he has, and for that I'm appreciative. It is a courageous thing to present independent thinking to the world because people will almost certainly disagree. But without some disagreement over what we already do or do not know, we can never learn anything new. And in our plain ignorance about so much, new ideas are our only hope for better understanding our universe. With that said, now I have to start disagreeing. So first, I will summarize the paper and where I am confused or disagree, then I'll get into some speculative extensions of the paper and where I see some of its fascinating ramifications. I also want to say that in the interest of saving space, I had to cut all the punchlines out of my jokes, so they're incomplete. If anything seems weird, that's why, or at least that's my story. All right. So the section on religion and science in here I think is a little bit problematic, particularly on page 6 of the paper, where Deacon and Cashman say, it was religion, not science, that first broke the theological synthesis of science and theology. I think this statement needs clarification and evidence because only some religion grew less interested in or opposed to science, I think. It certainly didn't stop hordes of Catholic priests and lay people who were natural philosophers and scientists from continuing to pursue their interests. This section can also benefit from distinguishing between religious individuals and religious groups, and unofficial religious practice versus official religious teaching. The discussion of mathematization, moving science away from theology, also needs clarification and evidence, I think. Why would mathematization do this? Geometry, which literally means measuring the earth, thus connecting math and empirical study, never threatened Greek religion, rather enhancing it, as was the case with Pythagoras' mystery cult. And indeed, the drive to mathematize and formulate scientific laws was often led by clerics, such as the Oxford calculators of the Merton School in the 14th century. Indeed, the medieval university relied on the trivium of logic, rhetoric, and grammar, and the quadrivium of arithmetic, geometry, astronomy, and music to prepare students for study of philosophy and theology, so it would be surely unexpected for this course of study to result in theologians rejecting math. The theological rationale embedded here might be summarized thus. A logical God, whose name is Logos, according to the Gospel of John in the very first verse, creates a logical world which generates logical creatures in it who can understand that logical creation from which they sprang forth and the creator behind it. The theologians steeped in such a worldview, finding math in nature should not only not be a surprise, it should be expected. All right, I'm going to skip a section here and go on to absence. So, I think there are two kinds of absences that need to be talked about here, and there are at least two kinds. There may be multiple. Maybe there's an infinite number of absences. That might be another interesting question in and of itself. When we're talking about the causal efficacy of nothingness, or absentialism, or the efficacy of absence, I think some additional clarification could be useful. It seems to me that nothingness comes in kinds. There are at least two kinds of nothingness or absences being considered in this paper. There's a formal absence and a final absence. They're not the same thing. Formal absences are present degrees of freedom excluded. It is a nothingness of constraint, of interferences and possibilities removed. Final absence is the nothingness of as yet unrealized goals, of future goals seeking to be realized. The paper considers this distinction somewhat, but I don't think it defines it clearly. Considering formal constraints are restrictions on matter. The matter will not do certain things, it will not move in a certain way or undergo certain reactions. Formal cause integrates things by actualizing precise conditions and excluding all other conditions. For example, if prime matter is pure potency, it could be anything, and so it's nothing yet. So if you want to make this kind of Aristotelian move back to prime matter and formal cause, I think some interesting relationships show up there in relation to the system. Loss of constraint leads to things falling apart. and disintegration. To be present also has two senses, a temporal sense and a spatial sense, a here and a now. Formal is more similar to the spatial presence or absence as it concerns what is or is not now, while the final cause is more similar to a temporal presence or absence as it concerns what may be or not be in the future. Final cause is not retroactive causation, as some people have accused it of being, but rather an anticipation of the future based on a stored memory of the past. If the future is too different from what is anticipated, then discord emerges, and selection leading to evolution may occur, which is something that's talked about in the book Incomplete Nature. What does it mean to say that there is more than one kind of nothingness? Does it mean that there is more than one kind of being or existence also? Could this crack an existence essence-based metaphysics wide open? Or when we speak of types of nothingness, are we merely speaking nonsense, tying our own minds in knots? This warrants some consideration, I think. Number 4, where do paradoxes live? On page 2, if the nature of existence is fundamentally incomplete, then does that mean it is also doing something, fulfilling some kind of function? What is the goal? Becomes the next question. This is interesting when considered in light of the parts of this paper on paradox and the apophatic call of an incomplete universe. If the true nature of the universe is contradictory or apophatic, then maybe science, or at least some scientists, really was wrong, and theology really was right, as in the discussion of the conflict between science and religion on page 6. Regarding paradoxes, incompleteness, and inconsistency, I have assumed, perhaps wrongly, that these sorts of logical contradictions and difficulties indicate flaws in our usage of our own symbolic systems and not actual flaws in reality. I'm open to revising my perspective, but I do not find the analogies of physical buzzers and Mobius strips and Klein bottles to demonstrate otherwise. Those are interesting phenomena in some ways, but they are not physical logical contradictions. A true physical logical contradiction is something else entirely, and I don't know what. I tend to think they don't exist, but as I said, I'm open to changing my mind. I believe the logical fault here, to paraphrase Shakespeare, is not in the stars, the natural world, but rather in ourselves, in our own symbolic systems. These questions involve, among other things, assumptions about the metaphysics of numbers and whether they exist in a Platonic sense beyond their physical instantiations in reality, or whether they do not. It seems to me that this paper takes a Platonic approach and assumes the imaginary number exists in a transcendent sense in the realm of forms. But that assumption, I think, has serious problems integrating it with the idea of emergence, because if a transcendent mathematical realm exists, then it seems to me there is not true ontological emergence, rather only apparent emergence from an ontology more like panpsychism. I'm skeptical of the proper translation of incompleteness from symbolic and representational reality to non-representational or physical reality. Symbols are extremely flexible, and they can literally be made to say anything because they are unmoored from the non-representational or physical reality. They're so unmoored that they can sometimes be used in ways that are nonsensical, like the liar paradox. Are there examples of non-representational physical reality, in non-representational physical reality, of real contradictions? Even if we could find them, we could not describe them without using language, perhaps in a contradictory way, thus masking the level upon which the contradiction exists. It looks most likely to me that if there's no possibility for teleology, then there's no possibility for contradiction. So, in other words, in purely physical reality, we're not talking about a teleodynamic level. It doesn't seem like a contradiction could exist there. Turning biblical, perhaps the product of eating the fruit of the tree of knowledge of good and evil was the source of paradox. In it, humans changed from animal to human, our eyes were open, we became estranged from nature and ourselves, we became paradoxes and mysteries to ourselves, unmoored from natural reality and lost in the world of good and evil that we could not comprehend with our inadequate and flawed symbolic systems. That biblical story is itself a great mystery, so why not make it the link to the source of all other mysterious paradoxes too? A mystery about the source of mystery. Perhaps the greatest example of paradox in nature is simply the existence of humanity itself. All right, 5, now to talk about God. The description of God as potentially necessarily incomplete I could find to be convincing for a pantheistic or panpsychic God, like that of process theology, but not for a transcendent God, like that of the 3 monotheistic faiths. A more traditional version of God interacts with reality intentionally, unmediatedly, directly, with no tools or symbols between creation and God's self. It seems to me that unless God contains contradictions, the contradictions we find in reality are of us, not of God. We may think that God is either inconsistent or incomplete according to our very tiny brains and unmoored symbolic systems. Perhaps a solution would be to more tightly moor our symbolic reality to non-symbolic reality. Then we would be less likely to confuse ourselves. I don't know how to do this. In some ways, Russell and Whitehead were trying to do this when Gödel ruined their project. Perhaps we might need an entirely new ontology in order to support these efforts, as Whitehead himself pursued. Perhaps Deacon and Cashman are on the right track even now. If God is outside of time, is pure act and has no unrealized potencies, and if paradox relies on time, then God, being outside of time, avoids paradoxes. Perhaps our lack of ability to understand God may also relate to our lack of ability to be pure being and pure act and atemporal and non-physical and so on. Our necessity for intermediates between us and other objects is a hard kind of separation. God is immediate and we are not. Our symbols get in the way, not only in language, but in our brains and biology. Primal divine nature cannot correspond to our derived conceptions of divinity. Perhaps a language capable of contradiction cannot express that which is the sacred definition of non-contradiction. If a language is capable of nonsense, perhaps it is also, in this sense, intrinsically profane. Whether this God is intrinsically contradictory or intrinsically non-contradictory, either way, this God is deeply alien to us. In this alienness and separation, two human urges tend to burst forth, and they are both found in ancient religion and in contemporary society. These two urges are for Gnosticism and Pelagianism. Gnosticism, because the alien makes us think that if only we knew more, we could relate better and so not be separated. Knowledge becomes salvation, and yet the depths of estrangement can lead to despair. Pelagianism, because we must be the ones to work to overcome this alienness, to gain this knowledge to reunite with God, or else reject God as too alien, too strange, too irrelevant, and thereby seek to become gods ourselves. As in contemporary science and technology, knowledge and work will save, and the new cult of transhumanism simply codifies this cultural movement and sacralizes it as the meaning of life. This alienness seems inescapable except for one thing. If we're Christians and we believe that Jesus is who he says he is, then God is not completely alien. God knows us not only because God made us, but also because God has been us and still is us, living in us. We cannot understand God, but if we believe in Christ, then we can be assured that God can understand us. All right, skipping ahead a little bit. If nature is intrinsically incomplete, as Deacon and Cashman assert, then if it analogizes to the incomplete natures that we already know of, it seems nature might also be doing something. If, on the other hand, nature analogizes more to Gödel's incompleteness theorem, then it can never solve for completeness or will attain contradiction. Next question is, which one is it? Deacon and Cashman have presented both options. It seems to me that the micro-level teleologies ought to add up to a cosmic teleology, which we cannot possibly understand, at least not yet. I think the ontology presented here makes more sense tuned into panpsychism rather than emergentism, but it's hard for me to tell because it seems to argue for each in different contexts. All right, now I'm going to skip ahead a little bit farther. So, I've said enough about the places where I disagree with Deacon and Cashman's paper. As I said before, it was courageous for them to present here this new, and I'm very grateful for what they've done. In fairness to their gift, I want to return the favor and say some things that are also provocative, and that so they can disagree with me too. I want to say I want to make some speculative leaps that are now possible, I think, because of Deacon and Cashman's ideas. So the first one is that humans are contradiction spreaders. If physical nature is non-representational and non-contradictory, which could be one interpretation of what's going on here, if we humans are the opposite, then as we grow in power and spread across physical reality, do we spread contradiction too? Let's run with the idea. The fruit of the tree of knowledge of good and evil is not unitary, holy non-contradiction, but dualistic, unholy contradiction. Separation, not union from and with God. Contradiction requires dualism, two things to disagree with each other, at least to some extent. Unity requires at least some type of monism. Perhaps this is why mystics cannot describe their experiences, because our symbolic systems are intrinsically dualistic, being built on the foundations of matter, yet existing in the realm of meaning. Direct meaning beyond matter is then perfectly inexplicable by nature. In order to not spread this dualistic potency for nonsense and contradiction, then what must we do? Perhaps we must become a civilization of mystics that strives for unitary reality beyond the unmoored symbolic systems with which we falsely mystify ourselves. And just to make it harder, this shared mysticism being grounded beyond language is also somewhat unteachable. So number 2, artificial intelligence. Building on the idea that life requires constraints, and therefore the evolution of life requires the evolution of constraints, we might note that some people are attempting to drive this evolution intentionally. Ultimately, maintaining not only the constraints for life, thought, society, and so on, will require resources that humans cannot handle. The necessary bureaucratic apparatus would consume all human life. It would be good if we could turn it over to an artificial intelligence. This AI could serve to maintain constraints, assiduously organizing society, researching the extension and enhancement of human life and thought. It would exercise power over power, a second-order power, a type of control which humans are demonstrably poor at. Yet this would also relinquish much freedom to the AI. If the universe is causally open and time exists to negotiate freedom, then this relinquishment of control to an AI might be deeply immoral, a poke in the eye of the universe. You want to say you want to do this, but I want to do something else. Additionally, this AI would be dead matter and still contradiction prone at that. There might be problems it still cannot solve, and glitches might introduce worse fates than we would imagine. Number 3, time as the working out of a simulation. These insoluble, incomputable problems for any AI we might construct might be of additional interest to us regarding the nature of reality. If, as Deakin and Cashman propose, time exists in order to resolve paradoxes, then perhaps time is the experience of a computational system working out some kind of very large and very complex problem. Reality then would be incomplete because the problem has not yet been solved. But when it is solved, will that universalize contradiction, or will it eliminate it forever? For we seem to have 2 vying forces at work, one of contradiction and one of non-contradiction. Which is more real? Which will ultimately prove the more powerful and the more true? If we're living in a computer simulation, computing a very complex problem of ironing out paradoxes or wrinkles in the fabric of reality, then we need to be prepared for the program to fail, just as whenever I iron something, whenever one wrinkle is ironed out, another new wrinkle appears. But perhaps the promise of a perfectly flat or perfectly wrinkled cloth should intrigue us. What are we aiming for in this incomplete universe? Contradiction or non-contradiction? What are we doing today to forward the purpose of the universe? As Deakin and Cashman described, time is a constant flicker of dimensional reversal, attempting to compute reality in the midst of contradiction. This flickering due to contradiction generates time and allows true freedom, and evolution has made one creature freer than the others, humankind, as we now drive technological emergence before us. Perhaps we are now computing the answer, not reality external to us, or maybe both of us are together. The puzzles are for us to figure out, so we can advance to the next part of the simulation as though it were some kind of great game. All right, number 4, causal emergence and totalizing transhumanism. Emergence agrees with the idea that new causal mechanisms can emerge in reality. Coincidence or chance consists of the crossing of 2 previously seemingly unrelated causal chains. Totalizing transhumanism, which is a particular kind of transhumanism which is trying to eliminate chance from the universe, then is trying to attain this complete power over all forms of power. Due to causal emergence, insofar as new causal chains can emerge ex nihilo, emergence may make this totalizing transhumanist goal impossible. Just when total control is achieved, some new cause will emerge and throw everything into chaos again. Or perhaps it will not, since humanity and transhumanity seem to be the prime sources of emergent causation in the contemporary known universe, creating such new things as electronics, computer programs, the internet, space travel. Perhaps this emergence, which will be human, transhuman, and AI-driven, will all be in the service of our control. So should humankind take over the process of emergence? This brings us to ethics, which is my last section. Should we is the prime question of ethics. Within Deakin's teleodynamics, there's an important point about life forms. Life forms, unlike natural morphodynamic systems which dissipate energy at full speed until they run to extinction, teleodynamic processes govern how they can expend energy so that they can maintain their own lives. Not immediately running to extinction is very important because entropy tries to kill life forms by injecting them with chaos. Therefore, to stop entropy, as the only creatures around able to do this, it seems we should roll back chaos ever farther until our control systems have edged it as far back as it can go. Is this our destiny? Order and chaos, non-contradiction and contradiction, physics and symbols, how do these align? Are the first all of one sort, with physics being all about order and non-contradiction, or is chaos more of these attributes? Hegelianism appears here too, and since I hate Hegel, I'm not happy to admit that. But perhaps thesis, antithesis, synthesis is a more fundamental ontology than I would like to admit. All right, in conclusion, I'm not wedded to any of the above ideas. Perhaps as symbolic products of a brain running on idiosyncratic meanings, everything written here is nonsense, the product of limitations more than understanding. I merely present them as responses and provocations in the hope that these theories will advance into their more interesting versions which await us in the future. The entrepreneur Peter Thiel has a saying that courage is in shorter supply than genius. In Deakin and Cashman's paper, I believe that we've seen both of these virtues at work. For this, I thank them for their insight and generosity. Thank you.
Gary, do you want to offer a response? So much. The idea that there's more than one kind of absence, definitely the case.
Okay.
No, we're just, in a sense, beginning to touch on it, I think. I'm always wary when people confuse absence with nothingness.
Okay.
Because that's exactly what I don't want to include.
Okay.
Nor do I want to confuse potential with possibility. For a couple of reasons. Absence is always with respect to something.
Mm-hmm.
Something missing. That's what subtraction is about in mathematics. And that's the sense that I mean it. And you did talk about two versions of it, in a sense, kind of retrospective sense of absence, and an anticipatory sense of, which is what we use the word potential on, something potentially on. So I think that's right. I think it's particularly dangerous to confuse it with nothing, because that confuses it with non-being.
Okay.
And I want to be, part of my message here is that absence is not non-being. And therefore absence is not nothing. Absence is the necessary complement to presence. And it's not something versus nothing. I know that's part of that message. So many other things. Let me just pick a couple to talk about. I love your sentence, where do paradoxes live? Because that's ultimately here. Is paradox fundamental, or is it just error? Whitehead made the statement that he thinks wherever there's a paradox, somebody's made an error. Now, he said that before Gödel, interestingly enough. I actually think that what we've discovered is that, as Gödel showed, consistency and coherence and completeness, perfectness and completeness, can't go together. And now, if there's a vision that somehow there's something that transcends all of that kind of thinking, whatever it amounts to, because maybe we're just got brains and we can't do what something else does. That's a different story. I happen to have a sense that the universe is understandable. That the universe is not beyond understanding. It's complicated, difficult, it tricks us. But in part, it's because of and you say it's about mathematics as well. In part, it's because of what someone has called the unreasonable power of mathematics. We discover, I didn't say it exactly right. I can't remember the exact word.
Effectiveness.
Effectiveness, thank you. I used one. Then in effect, what we're finding is that as we learn to manipulate symbols in this case, according to the rule of non-contradiction, avoid contradiction, and we discover all kinds of ways that we can do manipulations, at some point in time, we often discover, oh, that maps to the universe in some interesting ways. And so that's what gives me the suspicion that some of these really deep features of the very nature of mathematics should also have correspondence in the world. We just need haven't found them. So my attempt here was to look through this.
Right.
What else? I just have a couple of minutes. This also fits to the question you say, is paradox just nonsense? Is it just because we human beings use symbols and are contradiction makers? A paradox is not a contradiction. That's the first thing I want to say. A contradiction is where A and not A means not A. The paradox says you can't resolve whether it's A or not A. That's a difference than a contradiction. And I see, in a sense, a higher order. It's a contradiction that, in a sense, contradicts itself, maybe you could say, in an interesting way. So I don't think it's nonsense. I think there's a limited view of it that says contradictions are nonsense. Contradictions are making a mistake. If I see a contradiction in my mathematics, there's an error somewhere. If I see a paradox, it does mean there's an error in mathematics. And I think that's another take-home lesson from Greer. That is, if you find paradox in your mathematics, it doesn't mean that your mathematics is inconsistent. If there's an inconsistency, that is an error of excluded middle. I'll say one last thing, and there's so many other things we could go on, but this is about AI. There's a couple of sort of mythology, a lot of mythology about AI out there. I'm not going to go into all of that. But there's this worry, and Elon Musk has become associated with this, that is the moral AI versus the immoral AI. The problem with computation is that it doesn't do well with paradox. It's set up around avoid contradiction. I think the best story about AI comes from Jewish mythology about the golem. The golem is, in effect, given life, given animation, not given reason and discernment, but given rules to behave. This is what you must achieve. This is the goal. And the golem rigidly adheres to those rules. The problem is the golem ends up wrecking the society, according to this story. And I think that's the AI problem. I think the AI problem is if we're building AI, we cannot escape the golem problem. And so will there be wise AI? Only if it has a self.